His voice cut through the darkness like a blade, sharp and ancient. "You touched my son with your mortal hands. You broke a pact 2,000 years old, and with that, you bound yourself to me." The words echoed in a space I didn't recognize, even before my eyes fully opened. I was lying on something impossibly soft, yet I could feel a strange pressure around my wrists, a silken restraint that held me gently but firmly. My mind was a fog, a hazy swirl of confusion, and a dull ache behind my eyes. Where was I? My last memory was of locking up the diner, the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant clinging to my clothes. I worked 3 jobs, sometimes 4, just to keep my head above water, to keep my little sister, Mia, in her expensive medical treatments. My life was a relentless cycle of exhaustion, serving lukewarm coffee and hoping to make ends meet. It was anything but luxurious, but this was beyond anything I'd ever imagined. When my eyes finally focused, they were met with a ceiling so high it seemed to disappear into shadows, adorned with intricate carvings I couldn't decipher. The room itself was vast, bathed in a soft, ethereal glow from unseen sources, making the dark wood and heavy tapestries feel both grand and menacing. Every piece of furniture, from the colossal bed I lay on to the ornate, high-backed chair in the corner, looked as though it belonged in a museum, or perhaps a king's chambers from a forgotten era. It was beautiful, undeniably, but intensely unsettling. And then I saw him. He sat in that corner chair, an imposing figure cloaked in shadows, watching me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. His presence filled the room, heavy and absolute, like gravity itself. He didn't move, yet I felt scrutinized, dissected by eyes that seemed to hold millennia of knowledge and power. My heart hammered against my ribs, a terrified bird desperate for escape. What was happening? Who was this man? And how had I ended up in this impossible place, bound by silken chains, listening to words that defied logic? How did I, Elena, a simple waitress struggling to survive, get here? My life before that night was a testament to mundane struggle. My name is Elena Petrova, and for as long as I could remember, my existence revolved around the relentless grind. I was 24, and every day was a blur of diner shifts, catering gigs, and cleaning offices late into the night. The smell of fried food, cheap detergent, and old paper was the perfume of my life. I didn't have dreams of grandeur. My only dream was to keep my little sister, Mia, alive and healthy. She had a rare condition, and the medical bills piled higher than my hopes for a normal life. So, I worked. I always worked. My hands were calloused. My feet ached perpetually, and sleep was a luxury I rarely indulged in. But my heart, I like to think, remained stubbornly soft. I couldn't afford the luxury of cynicism. The diner was my longest-running gig, a 24-hour joint on the outskirts of the city. It attracted all sorts: truckers, insomniacs, the lost men, and the lonely. The 3 a.m. shift was usually the quietest, just me, the cook, and the hum of the refrigerators. But one cold, desolate night, that quiet was broken. The bell above the door jingled, and I looked up, expecting another tired soul seeking a hot coffee. Instead, a boy stood there, no older than 8, maybe 9. He was small, frail, and his clothes, though finely made, hung loosely on his thin frame. His skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were what truly caught me. They were ancient, filled with a weariness that no child should possess. He didn't speak, just stumbled towards a booth, his movements jerky and uncertain. Before I could even ask if he was alone, if he was lost, he simply collapsed. Not like a fainting spell, but like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He hit the checkered floor with a sickening thud, and a dark, viscous liquid began to trickle from the corner of his mouth. Panic flared within me. My heart lurched. This wasn't a sick child. This was something far more terrifying. He wasn't just ill. He was dying, rapidly, right there on my grimy diner floor. I rushed to him, my instincts overriding my fear. He was cold, so terribly cold. His breath was shallow, almost imperceptible, I remembered old wives' tales, whispered legends from my grandmother about poisons that could steal life faster than any disease. And then, a desperate, irrational thought sparked in my mind. A tale of desperate times, of pure human blood being able to counteract supernatural evils. It was insane, ridiculous, but I had no other options. I didn't think, I just acted. With trembling hands, I grabbed a discarded knife from a table. It was dull, but I pressed it against the soft skin of my inner wrist, ignoring the irrationality of my actions. A bead of my own blood welled up, then a thin stream. I cupped my hand and, with a silent prayer, guided his pale lips to my wrist. He barely reacted, but a small amount of my blood, warm and metallic, trickled into his mouth. For a moment, nothing. Then, a subtle change. The dark liquid from his mouth receded, a faint color returned to his lips, and his breathing, though still shallow, became more regular. He wasn't saved. Not entirely, but he was no longer actively dying. I sat there, my heart pounding, my wrist bleeding, holding this fragile, mysterious boy until the cook found us. He was a gruff man, but even he recognized the gravity of the situation. We called an ambulance, but by the time they arrived, the boy was gone. He had simply vanished, leaving behind only a faint, sweet smell that was entirely out of place in the diner. I dismissed it as a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. I cleaned up the small pool of my own blood, bandaged my wrist, and tried to forget the impossible. I had no idea that in my desperate act of kindness, I had reached across a veil of ancient existence, touching a world I didn't know existed, and setting into motion a chain of events that would change my life forever. I had no idea the chain of events I had just set in motion. The next 24 hours passed in a surreal haze. My wrist throbbed, a constant reminder of the bizarre encounter, but I managed to push it to the back of my mind. Mia's medicine wasn't going to pay for itself. I worked my other shifts, served my customers, and tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe the boy had just recovered on his own. Maybe I was overtired and hallucinating. Anything but the truth. But as I finally unlocked the door to my small, cramped apartment, the truth was waiting for me. The air inside was cold, impossibly cold for a summer night. A shiver that had nothing to do with temperature ran down my spine. My hand paused on the light switch. I wasn't alone. I could feel it, a prickling sensation on my skin, a heavy presence that seemed to absorb all the oxygen from the room. My breath hitched in my throat. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. Then he materialized from the shadows in my living room, as if he had simply stepped out of the wall itself. He wasn't a man. He was an entity, taller than any human I'd ever seen, with a lean, powerful build that suggested millennia of honed strength. His clothes were dark, impeccably tailored, but his presence was what truly commanded attention. It was ancient, terrifying, and utterly captivating. His face was a chiseled masterpiece, perfect in its severity, framed by dark hair that seemed to absorb the light, but it was his eyes that truly held me captive. They were the color of ancient amber, flecked with gold, and they held a depth that spoke of countless centuries, of empires rising and falling, of a profound, unimaginable solitude. They looked at me as if I were a curious specimen, a fleeting moment in his endless existence. He spoke, and his voice was the same one I'd heard in my waking dream. It was deep, resonant, and carried an authority that resonated in my bones. "You carry blood that should not exist," he said, taking a step closer, his movement fluid and silent. "You touched my son. This creates a bond that transcends your mortal comprehension. You are now intertwined with my destiny." My initial terror began to mix with a spark of defiance. Who was this man, barging into my home, speaking in riddles and making demands? "I didn't ask for any of this," I snapped, finding a surprising amount of courage in my fear. "I just helped a child. He was dying." His eyes narrowed infinitesimally, and a chilling smile, devoid of humor, touched his lips. "And for that, you still draw breath. Any other would have perished the moment my blood recognized yours." He took another slow, deliberate step, and I instinctively recoiled. But you awakened something I buried 1,000 years ago. He paused, his gaze sweeping over my small, pathetic apartment, then back to my face. And I cannot allow you to leave. Not now that the threads of our fates are so tightly woven. My mind raced. Was he going to kill me? Turn me into something monstrous? I thought of Mia, her sweet, pale face. I couldn't die. I wouldn't. What do you want? I demanded, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. He surveyed me for a long moment, a strange emotion I couldn't decipher flickering in his ancient eyes. I offer you a choice, he finally said. Stay with me for 30 days. Allow me to understand what you are. Protect my son while I hunt those who dared to poison what is mine. After that, we shall see if you still desire your mortal life back. He gestured towards a small, heavy briefcase that had appeared, as silently as him, on my tiny coffee table. For your time, and for the security of your sister's future, a token of my appreciation. He opened it with a flick of his wrist. Inside, neat stacks of crisp $100 bills lay, easily $1 million. My jaw dropped. It was enough to pay off Mia's hospital bills, to ensure her care for years, enough to lift the crushing weight from my shoulders. My heart pounded with a mix of terror and a strange, desperate hope. It was a deal with the devil. I knew it. But Mia needed this. I was trapped. But perhaps this was the only way to truly save her. I swallowed hard, looking from the money to his unwavering, ancient gaze. I accept, I whispered, the words sealing my fate. I thought I was just accepting a job. I was accepting a fate. The journey to his home was as surreal as his sudden appearance. He simply took my hand, a touch that sent a jolt of ice and fire through me, and the world blurred. One moment, I was standing in my cramped apartment. The next, we were in a grand hall, far beyond anything I had ever seen. The mansion was impossible. It didn't seem to exist in any discernible location, but rather in a place outside of time, a fold in reality. Its walls were made of dark, ancient stone, etched with glowing runic symbols that pulsed with a faint internal light. It was vast, silent, and felt alive with history. My initial days in the mansion were a blur of awe and terror. I was led to a suite of rooms that dwarfed my entire apartment, with silken sheets and furnishings that looked priceless. But the opulence couldn't disguise the feeling of being a caged bird, however gilded the cage. I was a prisoner, albeit a well-paid one, bound by a terrifying, ancient being. I met Nikolai properly then. He was just as I remembered him from the diner, but healthier, thanks to my blood. He was shy at first, a solemn child with those unnervingly ancient eyes. But over the next few days, as I spent time with him, reading him stories from books I found in the mansion's bewildering library, playing quiet games, he began to open up. He had an old soul, but he was still a child who craved affection. He clung to me, a sweet, vulnerable creature, and I found myself growing fiercely protective of him. He became my anchor in this impossible reality. Damien, I learned, was always watching. He didn't intrude much initially, but I'd catch his amber eyes on me from across the vast halls, from a hidden vantage point in the library, or through the tall, arched windows that overlooked the mansion's otherworldly gardens. He was studying me, I realized, dissecting my reactions, my emotions, trying to understand what I was, what my blood meant. He was an enigma, a creature of profound silence and ancient power. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were formal, almost archaic. He was a being far removed from human concerns, and our modern world seemed to hold little interest for him. He moved with a predatory grace, silent and swift, and often I wouldn't even know he was in a room until his voice, deep and resonant, startled me. I'd try to provoke him sometimes, just to get a reaction, to prove he wasn't a god. "You act like you're some kind of deity," I once scoffed, when he dismissed my concern about the mansion's lack of internet. He looked at me then, his ancient eyes devoid of humor. "I have seen gods born and die, Elena," he told me, his voice strangely calm. I am what remains when even the immortals are forgotten. My reply was instinctive, honest. That sounds like a terribly lonely existence. He simply stared at me, his expression unreadable, and then turned away. He didn't respond. But I felt a shift, a tiny crack in his impenetrable facade. No one, I realized, had ever dared to call him lonely. The tension between us, though unspoken, was palpable. It was a strange mix of fear, respect, and a growing, unsettling attraction. Our eyes would meet across a room, holding for a beat too long. Our hands would brush accidentally, and a spark would jump between us, a confusing jolt of energy. He was dangerous, terrifying, yet he was also the most fascinating being I had ever encountered. Late into the nights, after Nikolai was asleep, I would sometimes find him in the mansion's sprawling library, poring over ancient texts written in languages I didn't recognize. He'd be illuminated by the soft glow of a flickering candle, his profile etched in shadow. I'd sit on a distant cushion, reading one of the few English books I found, just enjoying the silence, the shared space. Sometimes he'd look up, and an unspoken invitation would pass between us. He started to teach me, slowly, about the runes on the walls, about the ancient languages, about the history of this world he inhabited. His knowledge was boundless, truly encyclopedic, spanning millennia. And I, in turn, found myself trying to bring a little humanity back into his ancient existence. I told him about my life, about Mia, about the small joys of a good cup of coffee or a sunrise. I talked about modern music, about silly movies. I told him a truly terrible joke once, and to my utter shock, a faint, deep rumble emanated from his chest. It wasn't a full laugh, not yet, but it was a genuine sound of amusement. He had, I realized, genuinely smiled, a true smile, for the first time, he admitted, in over 300 years. How could I be falling for a creature that shouldn't even exist, who embodied everything I should fear? Yet, I was. My days in the mansion continued to be a blend of education, awe, and a growing sense of unease. The more I learned about Damien's world, the more I realized how little I truly understood about my own. He had opened a door, not just to a magical realm, but to a hidden history of humanity itself. My own family, I discovered, had an ancestry far more complex than I'd ever known. One afternoon, while Damien was away on one of his mysterious hunting trips, I ventured deeper into the mansion's immense library. I had grown bolder, my initial fear of him tempered by his strange, protective demeanor towards Nikolai, and, increasingly, towards me. I found a section sealed off by a simple, almost insignificant rune, the very one Damien had taught me to recognize as a ward against unwanted intrusion. My curiosity, though, was too strong to resist. I touched it, and the barrier dissolved, revealing a shelf of ancient, leather-bound tomes that seemed to hum with suppressed energy. The first book I pulled out was written in an archaic script, but to my surprise, a faint, almost imperceptible voice seemed to guide my eyes. It was as if my very blood recognized the words. I read about my own lineage, a lost bloodline of ancient healers, gifted with a rare ability to mend not just flesh, but also the very essence of beings. We were called the Portadores, the bearers of the lost blood, capable of both immense healing and, terrifyingly, immense disruption. We were thought to be extinct, wiped out 1,000 years ago. Then I found it, a prophecy. It spoke of my kind, the lost blood. When the lost blood touches the primordial, the balance will be broken. She will be the key to his ascension, or his destruction. My heart seized in my chest. Primordial. That was the term Damien used for himself, for the first, original vampires. I wasn't just a random human who saved a child. I was a catalyst. My blood wasn't just a cure. It was a force. I also stumbled upon a series of journals, centuries old, written in Damien's own elegant hand. They chronicled his life, his long, solitary existence, and then, a passage that made my heart ache. He wrote of a companion, a human woman he had loved 1,500 years ago. He had transformed her, hoping to share eternity with her. But the transformation was too much. Not all humans could bear the shift without losing their minds, their very souls. His beloved had succumbed to madness, and Damien, in a heartbreaking act of mercy, had been forced to destroy her with his own hands. The grief, the guilt, the profound sorrow etched into those ancient words were almost unbearable. He had sworn then, he wrote, never to love again, never to expose another human to that risk, never to create another monster. Nikolai, I realized, was his attempt at family without the crushing weight of romantic love. This revelation changed everything. I no longer saw him as just a powerful, dominant vampire. I saw the millennia of pain, the impenetrable walls he had built around his heart to protect himself from further loss. My empathy for him deepened, transforming my fear and fascination into something far more profound. I was falling for an immortal being, a creature who embodied both terrifying power and a profound, beautiful brokenness. But the prophecy, the chilling implications of my own bloodline, and the very real dangers it presented to Damien and his world, settled a heavy weight in my chest. The more I learned, the more I realized I wasn't just a visitor. I was a key, and keys could unlock doors to both salvation and destruction, and I had no idea which one I was destined to be. The quiet unease that had settled in my heart began to morph into a cold dread as the days passed. With each ancient text I deciphered, each fragment of the prophecy I pieced together, the truth of Nikolai's poisoning became terrifyingly clear. It wasn't a random act, it was a meticulously planned trap. And I, Elena, the unsuspecting waitress, was the bait. The journals spoke of Moros, another primordial, a being as ancient and powerful as Damien, but driven by a consuming envy and a thirst for absolute dominion. They had been rivals since the dawn of their existence, their feud spanning entire civilizations. Moros sought to usurp Damien's unique power, his connection to the very fabric of existence that made him, even among primordials, exceptionally potent. And my blood, the lost blood of the Portadores, was the missing ingredient in a ritual designed to strip Damien of his essence and transfer it to Moros. The plan was chillingly simple. Poison Nikolai with a venom that only my specific blood could counteract, knowing Damien would seek out his son's savior. Then, ensnare me, use my blood at a precise astrological alignment, a rare lunar eclipse, and destroy Damien, consuming my own life force in the process. I was a means to an end, a disposable tool in an ancient war. I tried desperately to warn Damien. He was often away, hunting down the initial perpetrators of Nikolai's poisoning, still unaware of the larger, darker conspiracy at play. When he returned, I tried to explain, to show him the texts, the prophecy, but he was ancient, cautious, and incredibly stubborn. He dismissed my fears as mortal paranoia, my interpretations as misreadings. "You dabble in ancient lore, little Elena," he told me, his voice dismissive, though his eyes held a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. "Do not mistake fragments for truth." He believed my blood was simply a potent cure, not a fulcrum of destiny. He couldn't conceive that someone would leverage his son's suffering to bring me to him, the very person who could be his undoing. The eclipse was only days away. I felt a growing sense of helplessness, trapped in a mansion that was no longer a sanctuary, but a luxurious prison. A stage set for a terrifying ritual. My attempts to convince Damien were met with his calm, infuriating reassurances that I was safe, protected within his walls. He underestimated the cunning of his enemies, or perhaps the depth of my own potential. Then, the night came. The mansion, usually a bastion of quiet power, suddenly pulsed with a malevolent energy. A deafening crash echoed from the main hall, followed by the terrifying sounds of battle. Glass shattered, stone groaned, and the air filled with the metallic tang of blood, not just vampiric, but something else, something corrupted. Moros had arrived. My blood ran cold, but I also felt a surge of grim determination. I thought I understood the danger. I was wrong. The real threat was just beginning. The mansion erupted into chaos. The sacred silence that usually permeated its ancient halls was shattered by the clang of weapons, the snarls of ancient creatures, and the guttural roars of beings I couldn't comprehend. Moros hadn't come alone. He brought with him a horde of his followers. A terrifying army of vampires and dark entities. The very walls seemed to weep as the mansion, this place outside of time, was subjected to a brutal invasion. I found myself caught in the melee, shoved and jostled by figures moving with impossible speed. My human fragility was starkly apparent. I saw Moros then, his presence just as dominating as Damien's, but colder, laced with a malicious joy. He was a creature of absolute darkness, his eyes burning with a cruel intelligence. He spotted me, and a triumphant grin stretched across his face. "The little Portadora," he hissed, his voice like grinding stone. "You came willingly to your doom." Before I could react, one of his lieutenants, a gaunt, swift creature, seized me. My arms were pinned, and I was dragged towards a makeshift altar Moros's followers had already prepared in the mansion's central courtyard, directly beneath the path of the encroaching lunar eclipse. I struggled, screamed, my heart pounding with a primal terror. Nikolai, brave but foolish, tried to intervene. He threw himself at my captor, a small, desperate act of loyalty. The lieutenant backhanded him, sending him sprawling against a stone pillar. Nikolai cried out, clutching his head, blood already staining his pale hair. My desperation turned into a furious, protective rage. Then Damien arrived. His entry was not quiet. It was an explosion of ancient power. He moved like a dark storm, a blur of unimaginable speed and raw, untamed strength. His amber eyes, usually so composed, blazed with a terrifying primal fury. He didn't speak, he simply acted, a whirlwind of destruction tearing through Moros's ranks. He was not just a powerful being, he was an enraged god, defending his territory, his son, and now, I realized, me. The battle between Damien and Moros was a spectacle of impossible might. The air crackled with their ancient power. Shadows writhed, stones fractured, and the very fabric of reality seemed to strain under the force of their clash. They moved faster than the eye could follow, striking with blows that would have leveled mountains. Damien, fueled by righteous anger, fought with a ferocity I hadn't imagined possible. But Moros was his equal in age and almost in power, and he was cunning. He began to gain the upper hand, capitalizing on Damien's desperation to protect me and Nikolai. I was being held firm, my blood being slowly drawn for the ritual. The pain was distant, overshadowed by my fear for Damien. My mind raced, remembering everything he had taught me about the runes, about the mansion's defenses, a tiny, insignificant ward he had shown me, a personal sigil for focus and freedom. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. With all the strength I could muster, I focused, visualizing the rune, pushing my energy into it, drawing on a well of power I didn't know I possessed, a faint shimmer, and the bindings loosened. I was free, for a moment. Damien was faltering, pushed back by Moros's relentless assault. I saw Moros raise his hand, gathering a ball of dark, crackling energy, aimed directly at Damien's heart. It was a killing blow, infused with corrupted power that could destroy even a primordial. Without a second thought, without a shred of hesitation, I threw myself forward, screaming Damien's name. I had to protect him. I had to. A searing, excruciating pain exploded in my chest, worse than anything I had ever imagined. The dark energy ripped through me, burning, dissolving. My body convulsed, my legs gave out, and I crumpled to the ground. I felt the life drain from me, a cold, empty void spreading rapidly. My vision blurred, the vibrant, chaotic battle fading into a dull haze. But in Damien's eyes, as he turned, his face etched with horror and absolute panic, I saw something new and terrifying. He had lost me, and I was falling into the darkness, knowing I had saved him, but also that I was gone. The darkness was absolute, a cold, crushing weight that pressed in on me from all sides. There was no pain, no sound, just an endless, suffocating void. I was dying. I knew it. Or perhaps I was already dead. My consciousness drifted, a tiny spark in an ocean of nothingness, recalling fragmented memories. Mia's laugh, the smell of coffee, Damien's ancient eyes, Nikolai's small hand in mine. They were fading, dissolving into the void. But then, a flicker, a distant warmth, growing steadily, intensely, until it was a searing, agonizing heat that threatened to consume me. It was pain, excruciating, beyond anything I had ever known, but it was also life. A powerful current surged through me, remaking, rebuilding. I heard a voice then, faint and desperate, a sound filled with such raw agony and determination that it pierced through the darkness. It was Damien. He was speaking in an ancient tongue, chanting words that hummed with immense power, words that felt like they were tearing the very fabric of reality. I felt my essence being pulled, stretched, bound to something vast and old and terrifyingly potent. I gasped, my eyes snapping open. The pain was still there, a phantom ache in my chest, but it was ebbing, replaced by a strange, exhilarating rush of energy. Everything was sharper, clearer, more vivid than before. The scent of ozone, blood, and ancient stone filled my new, enhanced senses. My hearing picked up the faint drip of water miles away, the frantic beating of a bird's wing outside the mansion. My vision saw every minute detail, every speck of dust dancing in the ethereal light. And then I saw him. Damien. He was kneeling beside me, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking. His hands, usually so steady, trembled as he gently touched my face. His amber eyes, when he finally lifted his gaze to mine, were streaked with a dark, viscous liquid, tears of blood, flowing freely down his chiseled cheeks. He, the ancient, emotionless primordial, was weeping. His voice, when he spoke, was raw, broken, laced with an emotion so profound it shattered my heart. "I broke my oath," he whispered, his voice thick with uncharacteristic vulnerability. "I broke laws I myself had set in stone. I risked my own existence, Elena, because the idea of a world without you was more terrifying than 1,000 years of solitude. You do not belong to me. I belong to you. I always belonged, since the moment you saved my son without expecting anything in return." I reached out, my hand no longer trembling, and touched his tear-streaked face. His skin was cold, but beneath it, I felt a tremor of pure, powerful emotion. I understood then what he had done. He hadn't just transformed me. He had bound our essences, infused me with a part of his own ancient power, making me something new, something unprecedented, a semi-primordial. If one of us perished, the other would follow. He had tethered his immortal existence to mine. I looked into his eyes, seeing the millennia of pain, the deep-seated fear of loss, but also an overwhelming, all-consuming love. "You are impossible," I told him, my voice now steady, imbued with a newfound strength. Arrogant, infuriating, and terrifying. I paused, a small, genuine smile gracing my lips. "But you are also the most loyal, protective, and beautifully broken creature I have ever known, and I choose you. Not for 30 days, for forever." 1 year later, and my life was unrecognizable. The scars of the battle had long faded, both from the mansion and from my own being. I was no longer just Elena, the waitress. I was a semi-primordial, a creature of 2 worlds, with heightened senses, incredible strength, and a connection to ancient magic that I was still learning to harness. My human heart still beat, strong and true, but it pulsed with a rhythm tied irrevocably to Damien's. Nikolai, fully healed and thriving, now called me Mother, a word that brought a warmth to my soul I never knew I craved. He had, in his own quiet way, accepted my transformation, understanding that it meant I would always be there, just like Damien. We were a family, an unlikely, unconventional, eternally bonded family. Damien himself had changed. He was still the ancient, formidable primordial, but the profound grief and loneliness that had defined his existence for millennia had been replaced by a fierce, tender love. He still moved with silent grace, but now his gaze lingered on me. Softer, warmer. He was still a creature of shadows, but he allowed me to bring a little light into his ancient world. We didn't stay confined to the mansion. We traveled, protecting humans from supernatural threats, guiding others who, like me, found themselves caught between worlds. One evening, we stood on a balcony overlooking a sunset that painted the sky in hues of impossible violet and gold. Damien wrapped his arms around me from behind, his presence a comforting weight against my back. The wind, carrying the scent of ancient forests and distant oceans, ruffled my hair. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked him softly, tracing the lines of his arm with my fingers. "Breaking your solemn oath, tethering yourself to a mortal, albeit one who is now less mortal." He tightened his embrace, nuzzling his chin into my hair. "My only regret," he whispered, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated through my entire being, "is not finding you 1,000 years sooner." I leaned back into him, my heart full, my soul at peace. Our story, a legend born from an impossible encounter, was only just beginning. Comment where you're watching this story from and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.